up until a couple of years ago, I always believed that emotions were bad for your trading performance. It's basically something that's drummed into you from day one, isn't it? Keep your emotions out of your trading. And it seems from over 1,000 of you that took part in our polls, most of you agree with that too. But one thing that was a struggle for a long time was actually making that a reality. I mean, sure, it sounds like the right thing to do, but just like Kanyanga and Yuri Wiedemann here pointed out in their comments, and by the way, thank you to everyone for commenting, it's definitely something that falls into the category of easier said than done. So what's up with that? Is it just that they're undisciplined? Are they bad traders? Are they useless human beings? No, of course not at all. In fact, they're just saying what most people are feeling deep down, but have been too afraid to say out loud in case it means they're bad at trading and they're never going to make it. But here's the thing, a couple of years ago, I came across the work of a psychologist who mentioned that traders shouldn't be trying to take their emotions out of their trading. Instead, they should be trying to use their emotions as an edge. And it wasn't just their opinion either. In fact, they'd backed it up with a lot of credible evidence. Now, with my trading, I like to question everything. I don't just want to accept these common trading myths that are passed on from one trader to another since the beginning of time. Most of those things are way out of date and don't deserve to still be considered credible. So instead, I've always researched everything, I test extensively and make sure that if anything's going to play a part in my trading, it's going to be logical. So this was no different. I decided I'd dig deeper, and so I jumped headfirst into the world of neuroscience and psychology. And what I found out is that I was wrong. Emotions are not bad for your trading performance. It's just that we're not using them correctly. So in this video, I'm going to show you what I found out. I'm going to start off by explaining a bit about emotions and how our brain works. I'll try and steer clear of any complicated jargon or complex explanations about the systems that are at play in our body and in our brain. But by understanding that sort of foundation stuff, then when we move on to how emotions are used in decision making, it will all make a lot more sense. And then when we look at trading specifically and the studies that were done there, you'll become such an expert on emotions in trading that when we finish the video off by getting really practical about all of this and going through exactly what you need to do to start taking advantage of all of this to improve your trading performance, you'll be top notch. I know it's going to be a long video. If there's at any point things that you like, please do hit the thumbs up button. Let me know in the comment section. It's really important that you watch everything. All the information ties together to help you understand it all fully. And none of this is my opinion or my assumptions. It's all from leading experts and peer-reviewed studies. So I'll add some of the sources in the description box below if you're interested in diving further. But otherwise, all sound good to you? Okay then, let's go down this rabbit hole together. Throughout this, we're going to be referring to things as being conscious and non-conscious, meaning we're aware that our body is doing the things or not. Now, that's really important because we need to understand that a lot of the things to do with our emotions are done without us even knowing that is happening. And that obviously is going to affect our trading. So our body's emotional processing, in other words, how we form an emotion, is something that happens automatically and without needing our conscious awareness about the reasons for that emotion or the feelings about it. You know, we're not choosing to switch the emotional processing on and off. It's something that's happening non-consciously. At any point in time, our body has a feeling, and that's a good thing because that means that you're still alive. Like, phew. Now, when we're not experiencing an emotion, this will just be a background feeling, which we can sort of think of as being whatever mood we're in at that point in time. So we're continuously monitoring what our body is doing, and an emotion develops when we start to experience a change in our body and relate that feeling to something that triggered that emotional processing. So we can think of our emotional processing as being in two categories. We have primary and secondary. For example, imagine you're sitting quietly in a room and someone creeps up behind you and screams. You'll probably jump out of your seat, and afterwards you'll notice your heart beating quicker, and at that point you'll be aware of the feeling of fear. So things like this are your primary emotions, and they're innate. In other words, we're born with these sorts of reactions. However, we also have secondary emotions. Now, these are emotions that we develop as individuals, so they're different between each of us, and they're based on experiencing feelings in our life. And you know, there are different things that you'll get and they might change over time. We basically form connections between, on one hand, categories of objects, situations, things like that, and on the other hand, primary emotions. So we're making connections between those things. Now, this happens because we're able to feel our emotions and become conscious of them. And it's an evolution that has allowed us to protect ourselves even more than we'd be able to just with the primary emotions. So it means rather than just reacting to danger, we can actually preempt it and be more flexible in our response based on our previous interactions and what we know of those sorts of situations. So for example, if you see a lion in the wild, you might freeze or run for your life, depending on what your reaction is. But on the other hand, if you see it in a zoo, you might, instead of feeling fear, you might feel excitement and feel fascinated by it. Likewise, if you've had someone creep up on you before when you're sitting quietly in a room, you might be able to pick up on the sound of someone creeping, the floorboard creaking or something like that, and preempt it so that you don't jump out of fear. Maybe you can even react in advance and punk them back. However, we don't decide the emotional state that we want to feel. Our body doesn't refer to us and say, what do you think about this emotional connection? Is it right or wrong? It just does it, okay? Our brain creates these links between things and body states without any question. Now, this can be good. For example, if you nearly drown one day because the waves become too big, then in future, if you're in the water and you feel the waves getting bigger, you can get out to avoid a dangerous situation because you'll feel some sort of unease in your body. And it's because of that previous experience that you've had and you've built that connection. But it can also be a bad thing when our brain connects the wrong emotion with the wrong thing. Like for example, imagine that same experience, but now you're just afraid of any body of water, whether there are waves or not. So this can apply for also people, events, locations, basically anything. We might assign a positive or a negative feeling to something and it might be incorrect. And this can obviously cause problems, including for your trading. But before we get onto that, let's look at how this might happen. So when you go through an emotionally charged situation, there will always be things that stand out in your memory of it. Okay, when you think back to it, there'll be something that stands out. And there will be things that don't stand out to you, but are still very important. Now, the neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux gives a great example to explain this. I'm sorry if I ruined your name there. So imagine that you visit a foreign city. You've never been there before, it's in another country, and you come across this one street and you're robbed at gunpoint. Now, the thing that you'll remember most about this when you think back to it is that person with that gun in your face. Okay, that's the big thing that stands out there. However, other things might not stand out to you, but they're still significant, including places, sounds, smells, and lots of other things. So if you went back to that same street again, maybe even that same city or that same country, the person with the gun isn't necessarily in front of your face anymore, at least I hope not. But yet you still might feel uneasy about being there. In fact, you might even feel uneasy just at the thought of going there, just talking about it. So this means our brain is saving and using information about things that we've experienced that we're not even consciously aware of. Okay, we don't even know that we're feeling those things. We don't even know we've made those connections. We're reacting to information we don't necessarily seem to remember. So when you go through emotionally charged situations in the market, for example, whether good or bad, there may be something that stands out to you in your memory when you think back to it, but your brain is still storing a lot more information than you think. And your brain is incredibly smart. So if there are other situations, objects, or things that it thinks are similar in some way to a previous emotionally charged situation you've been through, even if you've never experienced this specific thing before, it will transfer the feelings. This is known as synaptic substitution, where a brand new stimulus can enter the circuits that a pre-wired one has used. So for example, you might end up feeling uneasy when you're in any foreign city, not just the one that you were robbed in, and you might not even know why you feel that way. And that last part of not even knowing why is actually really important, because we tend to think that if we have an emotional reaction, we know why we're feeling that way. We know what has triggered it. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Studies have proven that you can trigger an emotional reaction in the brain subliminally, without you being consciously aware of it. So to test this, they use something called backwards masking, and I love the sound of this experiment, where something that will cause an emotional reaction is flashed on screen, but so briefly that you don't notice it before something neutral appears and stays on screen instead. So the neutral thing that appears on screen blanks out that first thing, it masks it. So in your conscious mind, you're not even aware of that thing that caused the emotional reaction of ever having been there. Yet your body will still experience the emotional reaction, but you won't know why. Your heartbeat might get quicker, your palms might start getting sweaty, but you don't know. In other words, our emotional body responses are non-conscious. Our body may be reacting to something that we haven't even consciously noticed, and it might even be doing it based on a past experience we've been through that we don't even actively remember. Now, when we think about what this means for the markets and our trading, there are actually many other factors that we need to consider as well. For example, a lot of the emotions that we feel in the markets as traders are quite similar to fear. Now, if you're a brand new trader and you've never even looked at a chart before, like you're really just getting started and you have no previous experiences, then you'd have no reason to feel fear in one particular situation over another, as you have no point of reference to know what is a potential danger or not. So our emotions in the market are not primary emotions, they're not innate emotions, they're secondary emotions. They're formed through our experiences. So if you're feeling fear in the markets, it's because there's a connection in your brain that's been made based on a past experience. So that would suggest that there's been some sort of dangerous situation that you've been through in the past. But actually, when we go through a stressful or traumatic situation, our brain's ability to form an explicit memory is impaired in that specific moment. So it's very likely that after the situation has ended, we won't remember a lot of the facts and details about what happened. However, your body will still store information about that harmful situation, and you may experience a fear response in another different situation without knowing why, because you don't have the conscious memory of what happened, but your body has retained that information. So this means these emotions that you feel while you're trading could be giving you vital information that you otherwise wouldn't be aware of. You might miss these things if it wasn't for that emotional reaction. So all of that we've been through so far is laying the foundations. And if you're anything like me, then hearing about these things for the first time is like mind-blowing experience. Excuse the pun. If you found it interesting so far, please do hit the like button. But now I want us to start working towards making this really practical. So let's start off now by answering the question of, what does this all mean for decision making? Whether it's in trading or business, the common advice when it comes to decision making is that you should try and take your emotions out of the equation and be rational. However, as we know from things like behavioral economics, from the work of people like Daniel Kahneman or Richard Thaler, we know that people aren't rational in the way that traditional economic models suggest. But this doesn't necessarily mean that emotions will lead you to being irrational either. In fact, emotions are thought to be a critical part of decision making. This is something that was outlined by a famous neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio, with his somatic marker hypothesis. As we discussed just a moment ago, when we experience an emotional response in our body, our brain will store the emotions and the body changes, and these can then become somatic markers, which are feelings that have been generated from secondary emotions that are connected with predicted future outcomes of certain scenarios. So, if you think about when you're trying to make a decision about what you should do in a certain situation, how are you going to decide what course of action is best for you to take? Now, one way you could do this is to go through a mental cost-benefit analysis of all the potential options and outcomes. This means you have to break them down and keep in your mind what's good or bad about all the different options while projecting into different points in the future, so you know how it's going to turn out a week from now, a year from now, a day from now, to try and figure out what the consequences might be at different points in time, while also considering the thing that you're wanting to maximize or avoid, thinking about other people's reactions and so on, right? It's a lot. So can you see why this might be an issue if we take this approach for every decision we need to make? First of all, you're going to actually struggle to retain all of that information in your head to actually be able to figure out which option is best for you to take. And secondly, you'd be there all day just for one single decision. So how are you going to live your life like that when you've got to make decisions all the time? In reality, we know that that's not what actually happens. Even if you're an overthinker, you'll still usually make a judgment about most things in a matter of seconds or minutes. Now, this is thought to be thanks to how our brain uses these somatic markers from previous experiences. So in other words, how our brain uses emotions to help us in our decision making. So these markers aren't making the decision for us, it's like this sort of filtering process where the markers will help our brain to automatically eliminate some options or highlight other options for us to then consider when we're consciously deliberating over the decision that we want to make. So it's sort of like our conscious mind is the final decision panel after we've filtered out a lot of options that just aren't going to work for us. Now, this is likely to happen through a process where images of the different outcomes flash in our mind so quickly that the details aren't clearly defined or anything like that. It's almost instant. It's like simultaneous, rapidly. Now, when an outcome that's connected with a bad somatic marker comes to mind, right, out of all the outcomes that we're choosing, one that's connected with a bad somatic marker comes to mind, even though it's rapid, we'll still experience an unpleasant feeling. So this feeling acts as a warning away from the outcome. Keep in mind, we're not aware that this is happening. And when there's a positive feeling with a positive outcome, that's going to act as more of an incentive. So as Damasio says, the signal may lead you to reject immediately the negative course of action and thus make you choose among other alternatives. The automated signal protects you against future losses without further ado, and then allows you to choose from among fewer alternatives. So emotions are helping us to become more efficient in our decision making and to be more focused on the right things. But what if we've made the wrong emotional connections and therefore make the wrong decision? You know, it's also been proven that we're much more likely to bring up memories that are similar to the current emotion that we're experiencing. So what if things like that influence our choice of outcome? If we think about our trading, for example, we might have entered a high-risk, high-reward situation in the past and come out with the profit by luck. Now, we might have a positive somatic marker for similar situations in the future because of the favorable outcome and the good experience. And in fact, this is something that we see quite often with new traders when they win their first trades and it leads to them taking those risky actions again and again. Now, in terms of decision making, this is something that's been looked into. In a study from Feldman Barrett and Seo, they pointed out that studies on emotions and decision making usually fall into two groups. We've got studies which focus on our feelings leading to a bias and skewed decision-making process, known as the feeling as bias inducer group, and studies that focus on emotions enabling a better decision-making process, known as the feeling as decision facilitator group. Now, they suggested that these groups could actually be redefined as how people experience their feelings in decision-making and what people do about those feelings in decision-making. However, the two are not the same. As Denise Scholl, the trading psychologist, explains in her book Market Mind Games, people often think of emotions and emotionally charged actions as the same thing. But actually, we need to separate the two. We can look at emotions and the actions we take based on those emotions. So, Feldman Barrett and Seo ran a study on traders to see how emotions affected their profit performance. And in particular, they were looking at three areas: how intensely the feelings during the decision making are felt, known as affective reactivity; how able they are to regulate the bias generating influences, known as affective influence regulation; and how able they are to process the emotion information, known as emotion differentiation. And the results from this study were quite surprising. So let's start with the bit that wasn't much of a surprise. Shock horror, the result shows that the traders who were better able to regulate their bias generating influences, in other words, they had higher effective influence regulation, they had better daily returns. So they were less influenced by their current feelings when making decisions. So for any traders, that part is going to come as no real surprise. But the next result is very interesting, because you see, the traders who had a greater intensity of feelings, a higher effective reactivity, were the ones also who achieved better returns. It wasn't the ones who didn't experience these feelings, these emotions, that did better, it was the ones who did. So you can see in this model here what the contributing factors were that led to the best results. And what's interesting is that they found that influence regulation fully mediated the negative emotions, but not always the positive ones. And it's thought that this might be due to these traders being better able to differentiate between different negative feelings, but not the positive ones. And these findings aren't unique to just this study either. It's been found consistently that better decisions can be made when you have more intense emotional responses, as long as you can recognize those emotions and regulate them. However, there are other contributing factors that lead to successful regulation of these emotions and to use them as an advantage. One factor is the trader's level of experience. In a different study on traders in a bank, the less experienced traders had greater physiological reactions to market volatility than their more experienced colleagues. Now, since we know these are secondary emotions and that secondary emotions develop through experience, it may be that they just haven't developed the context to be able to vary their response correctly in the way that the experienced traders can. So it's just like what one neuroscientist said. We have to learn what to be afraid of, but not how to act afraid. All it takes to turn a meaningless thing into a fear-arousing event is just a few situations where that meaningless thing occurs at the same time as a negative or dangerous situation. Anything our brain thinks can help us to predict danger can cause us to feel fear in future, whether that thing actually does predict danger or not. And these responses can be very long-lasting and even permanent. I've spoken to you before about traders I've met who have lost such huge amounts of money during crashes that they have PTSD symptoms in the markets in situations where they're not even in any danger. And so based on that one, perhaps you can also guess what one of the other major contributing factors is in our ability to regulate our emotions. What do you think? It's the size of the risk or rewards. When the risk or rewards are too big, we're unable to mediate and regulate our emotions in the way that we should do. So we know that our brain is saving information from past emotional experiences and using those to influence our future actions. Those can be positive or negative somatic markers that help us to make decisions without us even being aware of these feelings. However, it can also be that we do feel the emotions based on something that we encounter being connected with an emotional response. Now, these situations may be positive or negative, and the emotional connection can also be incorrect. So our emotion might not even be appropriate. It may even be that it's based on something unrelated, but our brain is transferring the emotion from a different experience, and we don't even necessarily have to know what triggered the emotional response. It can happen subliminally and from information we don't even remember from previous experiences. So it could be that our brain is providing information we aren't even consciously aware of. So perhaps it isn't such a surprise then that people who feel emotions more intensely have been shown to generate better returns. However, the key factor is whether they can identify and regulate these emotions. So let's see how we can take all of this information that we've gone through and use it to our advantage in our trading in a practical way. The first step in regulating how our emotions will affect our decision making is to become more aware of them. Now, considering emotions could be providing us with vital information that we otherwise wouldn't have, we don't want to get rid of emotions altogether. And in fact, it's not really going to be possible to do that anyway. Instead, all we'd be doing is becoming ignorant of our emotions, and that could be much more harmful to our performance. So, since it's been proven that highly self-monitoring traders perform better than their peers, we want to monitor our emotions. That's how we're going to get the best out of ourselves. That's going to allow us to regulate them and use them for our advantage. So the trading psychologist I mentioned earlier, Denise Scholl, she says that this should be done as a 3-step process. First, you need to anticipate that the feelings will be there. Then you need to notice when they appear, which means that you need to practice becoming more aware. And finally, you need to be able to name the different combinations of feelings that you go through. Now, it was actually pointed out in a different paper that for some people, this will mean that you need to develop a richer categorical knowledge of different emotional states so that you can define them. Remember, a factor that helped to increase emotional regulation was emotional differentiation. So rather than just saying, I'm feeling bad, you should say if you're afraid, nervous, and so on. So it might be that you need to sort of develop your knowledge of what different emotions it is that you can go through. You need to be able to label these emotions. In fact, some people say that you don't truly know what you're feeling until you label it. And I would recommend actually writing it down at random points during your trading session and when you're in a trade. That way you can review it afterwards and see how it impacted your performance. But there are two really important things that we have to take note of here. The first is that you should notice the different emotional states that you're experiencing, but it's absolutely crucial that you observe and don't judge them. For example, if you start thinking things like, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this, or I'm really good at this, or whatever other judgment you might find, it can really interfere with what you're doing because it could lead to further emotional reactions, things like frustration, annoyance, anger, disgust. So it's important that we observe but don't judge. And the second thing is that it's very important you write it down as it's happening and don't just do it in hindsight. Don't wait till after the trade, at the end of your trading session, the next day, or anything like that. Work by Daniel Kahneman and his colleagues showed that our memories of an emotional experience aren't actually accurate. Instead, we have a remembered utility that differs from what actually happened in that moment. This includes something called the peak end rule, which they discovered through a study on people going through a colonoscopy, which we won't be discussing right now. But this could particularly affect your memory in situations, for example, where you have a huge drawdown in a trade and it ends up leading to profits in the end, and you look back on the experience differently. So you need to label what you're feeling in the moment and don't judge it. Now, some people actually believe that since our brain's motivational systems evaluate potential gains and potential losses independently, we'll experience stronger emotions when one system is more dominant than the other. So by being more aware, by going through these things to become self-aware, we can see when these systems are out of balance, and that's going to help us to regulate and take actions to offset that. And finally, some other ways to reduce the irrational impact of emotions include, first of all, cultivating a belief in our own ability to be wrong, so we don't end up thinking we're infallible or invincible, but realizing, yes, we can be wrong when we make decisions. And secondly, to visualize and practice difficult decision situations. For trading, perhaps you might want to use a simulator and throw yourself into the deep end and see how you'd react. Visualize what you'd be going through, what you might be feeling, how that situation, will make you change the way you're looking at things, and then think about how you should react. And by getting that sort of practice in, you'll be better prepared when you are in that sort of situation. So overall, I know there was a lot to take in, and this has been a very long video, but it was really important to me to give you all of that foundational information to put everything in perspective, because now you'll know that it's not possible for us to remove our emotions from our trading, and that actually our emotions could be providing us with extra information we otherwise wouldn't be aware of. But the only way to use that information to our advantage, rather than behaving irrationally and doing anything that's damaging to our performance, is to become more self-aware by using those techniques we went through at the end. Now, this has been proven in many ways to lead to good performance. So I hope, like me, you'll abandon the old thinking of, trying to take emotions out of your trading, and instead you'll think about how you can use them to your advantage to start trading even better than you were before. Now, if you have any questions or things that came up in the video that you want us to go into in more detail, let me know in the comments section. We do have some related topics that we'll be discussing in upcoming videos, which I can't wait for. I think they're going to be really interesting. So if you want to see those, and if you found this one useful or interesting, then please do just gently grace that like button with your presence to let us know. We'd really appreciate you doing that. And don't forget, there's not just one, but two channels to subscribe to. We have our second channel, Market Movers, that's for financial news and fundamentals. So check that one out. Buttons are all on screen. Thank you so much for getting through this long video. Please do watch it again if anything didn't make sense, and I will see you soon. Thank you. Take care. Trigger an emotional reaction in the brain subliminally. Subliminally. Jeez.